It all began with something that seemed too small to cause a storm: a fence. A simple wooden fence in the backyard of Mr. Allen's home. He had lived in the community for nearly 6 years, quiet and friendly, never causing trouble. But lately, peace had become rare for him. Every evening, he'd sit in his garden trying to unwind, and he could feel the eyes of the neighbors' children staring from across the yard. Sometimes they'd peek through the slats, giggle, and whisper. It wasn't malicious, just childish curiosity for him, but for Mr. Allen, it was an invasion of the small privacy he had left. He wanted his home to be his escape, a place where he could breathe without feeling watched. That's when he decided he'd build a taller fence. Just 2 extra feet, nothing fancy. A simple extension that would block out the constant eyes, the noise, the feeling of being exposed. To him, it wasn't about isolation, it was about peace. But the moment the wooden panels began stacking higher, the whispers in the neighborhood started. Some neighbors shrugged it off, but one person couldn't ignore it: Mrs. Peterson, who lived right next door. She was known for her immaculate lawn, her trimmed roses, and her constant presence at HOA meetings. To her, the new fence was not just taller, it was offensive. It blocked part of her afternoon sunlight, cast a shadow over her flower bed, and most importantly, broke the clean symmetry of the community's backyards. Mrs. Peterson complained to the HOA board. Her letter was neatly typed, polite, and filled with references to the HOA rulebook. All fences must conform to community standards and height limits. She even included photos, highlighting how Mr. Allen's fence stood out like a sore thumb. Mr. Allen received the notice 2 days later. He wasn't surprised. "Typical," he muttered under his breath. He wrote back, explaining that the fence wasn't an act of rebellion, but a matter of personal comfort. He even offered to paint it a color that matched the rest of the neighborhood. But the HOA wasn't satisfied. Rules were rules. What started as a letter exchange turned into something bigger, a conversation that spiraled into tension, and tension that turned into open hostility. The HOA called for a formal meeting to discuss the fence violation. It was supposed to be routine, just like any other complaint. But that evening, the community hall filled up more than usual. People were curious. Some came out of boredom, others out of loyalty, either to Mr. Allen or Mrs. Peterson. The air was thick, the kind of tension that comes when everyone knows a small issue has grown too large to ignore. Mr. Allen stood before the board, explaining his reasons calmly. He talked about privacy, peace, and personal boundaries. He spoke like a man who just wanted to live quietly, but Mrs. Peterson countered with passion. She said the fence destroyed the harmony of the neighborhood, that it was selfish, that it set a bad example. The HOA board sat between them like a jury. Rulebooks opened, photos passed around, murmurs rising from the audience. It wasn't just about wood and nails anymore. It had become something else, a symbol of freedom versus conformity. Neighbors began to take sides. Some said, "Let the man have his fence, it's his property." Others whispered, "If we allow this, what's next? 10-foot walls? Barbed wire?" Over the next few weeks, the conflict bled into everyday life. People stopped greeting each other. Sidewalk conversations turned cold. Children were told not to play near the Allens' yard. A community once built on unity now found itself divided by 6 extra feet of wood. The HOA sent more letters. Mr. Allen stood his ground. Fines started arriving in the mail. Each one was more aggressive than the last. He appealed, he argued, and eventually he stopped responding. For him, it wasn't about money anymore. It was about principle. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peterson became even more involved. She printed flyers reminding everyone that rules protect property values. She spoke at every meeting, her voice trembling with a mix of authority and frustration. "If we let this go," she said, "we lose the very identity of our community." But beneath her stern tone, some saw something else: pride. Pride that wouldn't let her back down. Pride that had turned a disagreement into a crusade. The board decided to escalate. They called for mediation. Both parties were invited to sit with a neutral representative. The session began politely enough, but as discussions dragged on, tempers flared. Mr. Allen said, "I just want to live in peace." Mrs. Peterson replied, "Your peace ruins mine." It was in that moment the mediator realized this wasn't about fences anymore. It was about control, about who got to define what peace meant in a community bound by rules. Weeks turned into months. The legal letters piled up. The HOA threatened to place a lien on Mr. Allen's property. Friends told him to just take it down, it wasn't worth it. But Mr. Allen couldn't. Every time he looked at that fence, it reminded him of something bigger, his right to choose what happened on his own land. The day enforcement officers came to inspect the property, neighbors peeked through their curtains. It was silent except for the sound of their boots crunching on gravel. Mr. Allen watched as they measured, took notes, and left without saying much. Later that week, the HOA issued a final warning. Failure to comply will result in legal action. The next morning, Mr. Allen stood by the fence, running his hand along the wood. It wasn't perfect. It had splinters and rough edges, but to him it was a symbol. Not of defiance, but of dignity. He looked over at Mrs. Peterson's yard. She was standing there too, arms crossed, expression tight. For a moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke. Both had lost something. The neighborhood that once felt like home now felt like a battlefield. Every HOA meeting since then became a reminder of that divide. People began referencing the fence whenever a new conflict arose. It had become legend, the line between freedom and order. Months later, Mr. Allen eventually gave in. The fines had become unbearable, and the threat of legal fees loomed too large. He hired a contractor, and the fence came down piece by piece. With every thud of falling wood, it felt like a small defeat. But strangely, something changed after that. The community didn't celebrate. Mrs. Peterson didn't feel victorious. There was no applause, no sense of resolution. Instead, there was silence. A heavy, awkward silence that filled the spaces between houses. It took time, but slowly people realized the cost of what had happened. A community that once prided itself on togetherness had fractured. The HOA's name became a symbol of control, not care. Even Mrs. Peterson began skipping meetings. And Mr. Allen. He spent less time outside, more time indoors, curtains drawn. Years later, new families moved in. The story of the fence fight became a cautionary tale for new homeowners. Parents would say, "Don't make the same mistake. Keep peace with your neighbors." But those who had lived through it knew the truth. It wasn't the fence that ruined their peace. It was the unwillingness to compromise. Because in every HOA dispute, there are two kinds of battles. The ones fought with paperwork, and the ones fought with pride. And the latter always leaves the deepest scars. In the end, that fence stood for something much larger. It wasn't just wood. It was the invisible wall that forms when understanding disappears. When community rules start mattering more than the humans they're meant to protect. And that's the sad irony. HOAs are supposed to preserve beauty and peace. But sometimes, in their quest for order, they destroy the very harmony they claim to defend. The moral of the story is simple yet powerful. Peace doesn't come from rules, it comes from respect. Because when a fence becomes more important than a friendship, everyone loses. When the HOA board finally stepped in, things didn't calm down. They exploded. What had started as a neighborly disagreement over a few extra planks of wood now turned into a full-blown neighborhood event. The board president, Mr. Raymond, called for an emergency meeting, something that hadn't happened in years. The announcement was sent through every inbox, every mailbox, and every community notice board. The message was simple but heavy. Emergency HOA session. Fence violation. Attendance requested. By the evening, the community hall was packed. Folding chairs scraped across the floor, voices filled the air, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in months now sat shoulder to shoulder, divided by opinion, united by curiosity. Some people brought copies of the HOA rules printed in neat binders. Others came with their arms crossed, ready to argue. Mr. Raymond sat at the center table, his expression a mix of exhaustion and authority. He had seen disputes before, over mailboxes, over garden gnomes, even over holiday lights. But this one was different. The energy in the room was tense, almost electric. On one side sat Mr. Allen, calm but clearly worn out. On the other side was Mrs. Peterson, her hands resting on a stack of papers and photos like a lawyer ready for trial. When Mr. Raymond banged the gavel, the murmurs stopped. "Let's keep this civil," he said. But everyone already knew. Civility was long gone. Mrs. Peterson spoke first. Her voice was controlled, sharp, and filled with certainty. This fence violates Section 4, Paragraph 7 of our HOA design standards. It disrupts the neighborhood's open and friendly aesthetic. We all bought homes here for a reason, for beauty, harmony, and order. If one person decides to break the rules, what's next? She held up a photo of Mr. Allen's fence. The audience murmured. The picture looked harmless enough, just wood and paint, but the way she presented it made it feel like evidence in a crime. Then came Mr. Allen's turn. He stood slowly, his voice quieter but filled with conviction. I built that fence because I needed privacy. My yard faces 3 houses. I can't even have dinner outside without feeling watched. I didn't mean to upset anyone. I just wanted peace in my own home. A man from the back shouted, "He's got a point! We all deserve privacy." Others clapped lightly. But before the applause could build, another neighbor, a friend of Mrs. Peterson, shot back, "Then move to a farm! This is a community." That's when the shouting began. Mr. Raymond had to bang the gavel again. "Enough! Everyone will get their turn." But the meeting had already shifted tone. It wasn't a discussion anymore, it was a courtroom drama. People started taking sides. Half the neighbors rallied behind Allen, saying the HOA had gone too far, that the rules were suffocating. The other half supported Peterson, claiming that standards keep property values high and that one broken rule leads to chaos. Even the board members were divided. Some whispered that maybe the rulebook was outdated. Others insisted the rule was sacred, part of what made the community desirable. The debate stretched into hours. The clock ticked past 9, then 10. Coffee cups were empty. Tempers weren't. At one point, a younger board member, Ms. Flores, spoke up. "Maybe we can compromise," she said. "What if he paints it or adds decorative panels? It could blend better." But Mrs. Peterson quickly dismissed the idea. "It's not about color. It's about precedent. If we bend the rule once, we'll bend it again." Her words hit the room like a hammer. The tension rose again. Then came the most chilling moment of the night. Mr. Raymond leaned forward, his voice firm, almost rehearsed. "The board has consulted our legal advisor," he said. "If necessary, we have the authority to force removal of any non-compliant structure." That one word, force, echoed in the air. The room fell silent. You could hear someone's pen drop. Even Mrs. Peterson shifted uneasily. For Mr. Allen, that word changed everything. Up until then, it had felt like a disagreement, maybe even an unfair one, but now it felt like a threat. He wasn't just facing a complaint anymore. He was facing a system. He looked around the room. People avoided his gaze. A few friends gave him sympathetic nods, but most looked down at their papers or phones. In that moment, he realized he was outnumbered, not by people, but by the power of rules written long before he'd ever moved in. Mr. Allen clenched his jaw, his voice steady but heavy. "So that's it, huh? My fence is an eyesore, but the dozens of violations you ignore, the broken mailboxes, the peeling paint, that's fine because it's not me. You only enforce rules when it's convenient." Gasps filled the room. He wasn't wrong. Everyone knew some rules were enforced more strictly depending on who broke them. Mr. Raymond straightened his tie. "Mr. Allen, please, we're not here to argue about fairness. We're here to maintain order." Allen laughed bitterly. "Order or control?" That line cut deep. People shifted in their seats. It was the kind of question that no one wanted to answer, but everyone was thinking. Mrs. Peterson crossed her arms. "You're turning this into something it's not," she said coldly. "We all follow the same rules." Allen turned toward her. "Then maybe the rules need to change, that was it." The room erupted again, shouting, arguing, voices overlapping in chaos. What was once a peaceful hall now sounded like a battlefield. By the time the meeting ended, there was no resolution. Mr. Raymond announced that the board would review the matter further and issue a decision within a week. People filed out quietly, exhausted. Neighbors who used to wave at each other now avoided eye contact. Outside, under the streetlights, Mr. Allen stood by his truck, staring back at the hall's glowing windows. The laughter and chatter that once defined community gatherings were gone, replaced by bitterness and distrust. He got in his car and sat there for a while before driving home. As he passed Mrs. Peterson's house, he saw her silhouette by the window, curtain slightly open, watching. Neither of them waved. Neither of them smiled. That night, Mr. Allen couldn't sleep. The word force echoed in his head like a drumbeat. He knew what it meant. It meant that the fence wasn't just a structure anymore. It was now a battleground, and as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something painfully clear. This wasn't about wood or privacy or even aesthetics. It was about power, and once power enters a neighborhood dispute, there's no such thing as peace, only winners and losers. It didn't take long before the issue began to spill out of the HOA meetings and into everyday life. What had once been just a small disagreement between two homeowners started to infect the entire neighborhood like a quiet storm. At first, it was subtle, a change in tone, a shorter wave, a door closed a little faster. The people who had once borrowed sugar from each other or exchanged holiday cards now crossed the street rather than make eye contact. The warmth that defined Maplewood Lane was slipping away, one awkward silence at a time. Mr. Allen would mow his lawn, pretending not to see Mrs. Peterson standing on her porch. She'd fold her arms and stare at the towering wooden fence that had now become a symbol, not of privacy, but of division. A few neighbors tried to stay neutral at first, but even that became impossible. Soon everyone had an opinion. Some started calling themselves Team Privacy, arguing that a man had every right to feel comfortable in his own backyard. Others called themselves Team Unity, claiming that fences went against the spirit of their open, friendly community. What used to be a quiet evening stroll turned into a silent battlefield where glances spoke louder than words. Then came the whispers, small conversations behind closed doors, in driveways, or over coffee tables. People started keeping track of who was siding with whom. Someone even began taking pictures of the fence at different angles, posting them online with sarcastic captions like, "The Great Wall of Allen." It didn't take long before the local community app caught fire. Within days, hashtags began to spread. Fence fight, privacy war, and the one that stuck the most, of course, Fencegate. What was once a friendly online space for garage sales and birthday party invites had now become a virtual battlefield. Neighbors were debating in comment sections like lawyers in courtrooms. Memes were being shared, jokes were made, and people who barely spoke in person were now tagging each other in heated posts. Even the kids started to feel the tension. The Petersons' grandchildren, who used to play tag with the Allen twins, were suddenly told not to cross that yard. Birthday invitations stopped being shared between the two families. Laughter that once filled the cul-de-sac now echoed faintly, replaced by uneasy quiet. And then there was the mail carrier, Mr. Joe. He'd been delivering letters there for nearly 20 years. He noticed the change before anyone else did. He used to stop and chat with the neighbors, share a joke or two, and get a cookie from Mrs. Peterson during the holidays. But now when he walked down the street, he could feel it. The air was heavy. The smiles were gone. Doors that were once open were now closed before he even reached the gate. "You can tell when a place loses its peace," he would later say. "You can feel it in the silence." The HOA board tried to calm things down by posting official statements. "We are reviewing the matter," they said. But it only made things worse. Each announcement became fuel for a new round of debates online. Screenshots of emails leaked, audio clips from meetings surfaced, and suddenly everyone was a self-proclaimed expert on community law. Behind closed doors, the Allen and Peterson families began to isolate themselves further. The Allens avoided neighborhood gatherings, fearing judgmental looks. The Petersons complained to anyone who would listen that the fence ruined their view. It wasn't about the wood, the height, or even the rules anymore. It was about pride, respect, and the invisible line that had now cut the community in half. Children grew quieter. Lawns grew slightly less maintained. And even the air seemed different, thicker somehow, filled with tension that refused to go away. On Sunday mornings, when people used to chat over coffee after the HOA newsletter arrived, they now just scanned it quickly and tossed it aside. No one wanted to be reminded of the fence issue. It was exhausting, like living in a Cold War fought with silent glares instead of weapons. The once peaceful Maplewood Lane had lost something far greater than its charm. It had lost its togetherness. And the saddest part? All of it began with a simple wooden fence. It didn't take long before the issue began to spill out of the HOA meetings and into everyday life. What had once been just a small disagreement between two homeowners started to infect the entire neighborhood like a quiet storm. At first, it was subtle, a change in tone, a shorter wave, a door closed a little faster. The people who had once borrowed sugar from each other or exchanged holiday cards now crossed the street rather than make eye contact. The warmth that defined Maplewood Lane was slipping away, one awkward silence at a time. Mr. Allen would mow his lawn, pretending not to see Mrs. Peterson standing on her porch. She'd fold her arms and stare at the towering wooden fence that had now become a symbol, not of privacy, but of division. A few neighbors tried to stay neutral at first, but even that became impossible. Soon everyone had an opinion. Some started calling themselves Team Privacy, arguing that a man had every right to feel comfortable in his own backyard. Others called themselves Team Unity, claiming that fences went against the spirit of their open, friendly community. What used to be a quiet evening stroll turned into a silent battlefield where glances spoke louder than words. Then came the whispers, small conversations behind closed doors, in driveways, or over coffee tables. People started keeping track of who was siding with whom. Someone even began taking pictures of the fence at different angles, posting them online with sarcastic captions like, "The Great Wall of Allen." It didn't take long before the local community app caught fire. Within days, hashtags began to spread. Fence fight, privacy war, and the one that stuck the most, FenceGate. What was once a friendly online space for garage sales and birthday party invites had now become a virtual battlefield. Neighbors were debating in comment sections like lawyers in courtrooms. Memes were being shared, jokes were made, and people who barely spoke in person were now tagging each other in heated posts. Even the kids started to feel the tension. The Petersons' grandchildren, who used to play tag with the Allen twins, were suddenly told not to cross that yard. Birthday invitations stopped being shared between the two families. Laughter that once filled the cul-de-sac now echoed faintly, replaced by uneasy quiet. And then there was the mail carrier, Mr. Joe. He'd been delivering letters there for nearly 20 years. He noticed the change before anyone else did. He used to stop and chat with the neighbors, share a joke or two, and get a cookie from Mrs. Peterson during the holidays. But now when he walked down the street, he could feel it. The air was heavy. The smiles were gone. Doors that were once open were now closed before he even reached the gate. "You can tell when a place loses its peace," he would later say. "You can feel it in the silence." The HOA board tried to calm things down by posting official statements. "We are reviewing the matter," they said. But it only made things worse. Each announcement became fuel for a new round of debates online. Screenshots of emails leaked, audio clips from meetings surfaced, and suddenly everyone was a self-proclaimed expert on community law. Behind closed doors, the Allen and Peterson families began to isolate themselves further. The Allens avoided neighborhood gatherings, fearing judgmental looks. The Petersons complained to anyone who would listen that the fence ruined their view. It wasn't about the wood, the height, or even the rules anymore. It was about pride, respect, and the invisible line that had now cut the community in half. Children grew quieter. Lawns grew slightly less maintained, and even the air seemed different, thicker somehow, filled with tension that refused to go away. On Sunday mornings, when people used to chat over coffee after the HOA newsletter arrived, they now just scanned it quickly and tossed it aside. No one wanted to be reminded of the fence issue. It was exhausting, like living in a Cold War fought with silent glares instead of weapons. The once peaceful Maplewood Lane had lost something far greater than its charm. It had lost its togetherness. And the saddest part? All of it began with a simple wooden fence. The next HOA meeting was different from any before it. The usual chatter, the whispered complaints, the sound of paper shuffling, all of it seemed muted. People came in quietly, carrying not just their documents but the weight of weeks of tension. The community room, which had once echoed with accusations and angry tones, now carried an odd stillness and a quiet that demanded attention. Mr. Raymond, the HOA president, adjusted his glasses as he looked around the table. For the first time, everyone was seated on time. There were no side glances, no whispered jokes, no one scrolling through their phones pretending not to care. Everyone was waiting. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Then slowly Mr. Allen stood up. He wasn't the same man who had once argued passionately about his right to privacy. The storm, both outside and inside, had changed him. His face was calmer, his voice steadier, and his eyes, though tired, carried a quiet strength. He placed his hands on the table, took a breath, and spoke. I built that fence to keep peace, he began, his tone measured and low. But peace doesn't come from walls. It comes from understanding. The room fell completely silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow down. For a moment, everyone just looked at him. Neighbors who once avoided his gaze, people who had taken sides, even Mrs. Peterson, who sat a few chairs away. Her eyes softened. There was something in Alan's voice, not pride, not defiance, but truth. He continued, "We all moved here for the same reason, to live in a safe, beautiful place. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that beauty isn't just about lawns and fences. It's about how we treat each other." A faint murmur rippled through the room, a sigh here, a nod there. Mrs. Peterson looked down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She remembered that day after the storm, how awkward it had been to stand beside him, holding a hammer, not knowing what to say, and yet, how easy it became once they started working. Mr. Raymond leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Allen," he said quietly, "what do you propose we do?" Allen smiled faintly. "We stop focusing on punishment," he replied. "We start talking more, listening more. The rules shouldn't just protect the property. They should protect the people who live behind those doors." It was such a simple statement, yet it felt revolutionary. For months, their meetings had been about violations, warnings, fines, and control. Now, for the first time, someone was talking about connection, empathy, and understanding. The lawyer sitting in the corner closed his notebook slowly, almost relieved. Even he knew that not every problem could be solved by rules. Some needed heart. Mrs. Peterson finally raised her hand. "I agree," she said softly. "I think maybe we've all been looking at fences the wrong way. They're not supposed to separate us. They're supposed to outline what we share, our boundaries, not our divisions." A few people clapped, hesitant at first, then more joined in. The energy in the room shifted, like a gust of fresh air had pushed through months of stale tension. Mr. Raymond smiled, his voice warmer than it had been in a long time. "Then let's make it official," he said. "We'll revise the HOA charter, less about penalties, more about participation. If someone has a concern, we start with conversation before we start with conflict." For the first time in months, people actually smiled at one another. The atmosphere felt lighter. Someone cracked a small joke about the Great Fence War, and laughter followed. It wasn't the same kind of laughter they used to share, but it was genuine, healing. Outside, the sun dipped low, bathing the rows of homes in golden light. Through the windows, you could see the newly repaired fence in Mr. Allen's yard. It wasn't as tall as before. Both sides had agreed to meet halfway, literally and symbolically. A middle height, one that allowed privacy but didn't block out the view of the neighbor's garden. A few days later, children were playing again between the yards. A ball bounced over the fence, and this time, instead of glares, there were smiles. Mr. Allen handed it back with a grin. Mrs. Peterson waved from her porch. The tension that once hung heavy in the air had finally begun to dissolve. The neighborhood felt alive again. Not perfect, but real. People started hosting small get-togethers, shared gardening tips, and even created a community newsletter titled Beyond the Fence. It wasn't about gossip or rules. It was about connection. The fence remained, but it had changed its meaning. It stood not as a symbol of division, but as a reminder. Boundaries can exist without bitterness, and differences don't have to mean distance. Mr. Allen often looked at it from his window, sipping his coffee in the mornings. He would smile, thinking about how something so small, a few wooden panels, had almost torn apart a community, and yet, in the end, had brought it closer than ever before. He had learned something profound, something that echoed in his heart every time he saw the sun rise behind that fence. Peace doesn't come from the barriers we build, but from the bridges we choose to cross, and perhaps that's what the HOA was meant to be all along. Not an authority, but a reminder that communities thrive not because of walls, but because of understanding.